This is a lecture about forest pathology. Forest pathology is a field of forestry research that deals with diseases, better understanding of what diseases are, what they are caused by, and how we can control them. So we learn a lot about the biology of diseases, but also about how to manage them to try to prevent them in the future. So this is what I'm going to give a lecture about today, and on the picture you can see lots of the different types of diseases, and we're going to cover some of those different disease groups, a lot of different variety of pathogens and of symptoms caused by these pathogens, and we're going to just cover some of those, the most important ones in this lecture. So the way the lecture is planned, so first I'm going to talk to you about what's a healthy forest. So this is a very important concept because it means different things to different people, and we're going to talk about that. The second thing is we're going to talk about the role of fungi in the forest. Not all fungi are pathogens. A lot of different fungi do different things in the forest. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to zoom in into the pathogens. We're going to talk about how you actually recognize and identify pathogens. And then we're going to talk about different groups of diseases, the most important groups, so the decay fungi, the root diseases, the rust and the foliar diseases, and I'm going to cover the first three groups because there's not enough time to cover everything, and then I'm going to conclude. So this is the plan of the lecture. So what is a healthy forest? Like I said, healthy can mean different things to different people. It depends a lot of the people who is looking at the forest. For some people, a healthy forest is a forest where there's wildlife, for example. That's all that matters to them. If the animals are happy, the forest must be healthy. To other people, like forest companies, for example, a healthy forest is a forest where there's a lot of trees, and very densely planted, all the same species, the same age, because it's easier for them to harvest and make money. So for a forest company, that's a healthy forest. For others, people interested in conservation, a healthy forest is what you see on the right. It's a forest an old growth forest that to some look at different age classes. It's got old trees and young trees. You've got openings. To some it looks very messy, but to others it looks like this is what a real forest should look like. And of course, some people think that dead trees, for example, is part of a healthy forest because this is a very nice place where eagles and owls can perch and look for prey, and this is an important integral part of a healthy forest for some. Now, some people think that disease is part of a healthy forest, and you can see here an infection center of a root pathogen. And for some people, this is a very healthy forest because that creates openings, it lets light in, creates succession, and so on. But of course, for others, if you're a landowner and if this disease center is on your plot, you're probably not very happy because you have dead trees on your plot instead of living trees. And finally, even forest fires. Some people think that forest fires are part of the natural system and that it's good, and a healthy forest should have forest fires. Other people disagree and think we should control forest fires. So in a nutshell, it depends on how on what your relationship to the forest is, whether what your definition of a healthy forest is. In a way, also, scale matters, okay, and spatial scale in particular. That means the space within the forest and how the disease is distributed along the space. If you take a root disease, for example, if you have 50% of a stand which is infected by a root disease, Douglas fir stand, for example, in a 50 hectare plot, do you consider that a healthy forest? Well, if you walk to that forest, you'll see what you're looking at on the screen now. Some dead trees, some roots that are turned over. It looks like a diseased forest. But if you go up the scales, if you zoom out and look at the larger picture, say 5,000 hectares, maybe this is what you're going to see. As a whole, the forest is healthy, but there are some small spots of infection centers that are diseased, but the forest as a whole is healthy. So it really depends at the scale that you look at, whether or not you consider the forest is healthy. So that's a very important aspect. Another important aspect is the temporal scale. The time that you look at the forest, and because during that cycle, the succession will bring different biotic and abiotic disturbances, and the agents will change along the cycle. So, for example, early in the succession, you get a lot of seedling diseases, because after a forest fire, for example, you'll get a lot of seedlings growing, and then you get a high density of seedlings, and you will get seedling diseases that will take out some of the seedlings, so that you end up at the end with fewer trees growing. So that's good for the forest. Somewhere in the middle of the cycle, you start having a lot of foliar diseases, some black stain, some mistletoe diseases, and these kind of build up towards the middle of the succession and then kind of phase out as the canopy closes. And then you have the cankers, the stem rust. These are like young tree diseases. So you get that on seedlings, on young trees, but usually after the trees are 25, 30 years old, they fade away. Okay, so the trees have thicker barks, and they're not so susceptible to these cankers and rusts, and then you're sort of out of it. And finally, at the end of the cycle, what you get are decays and root rots, and those are the ones that sort of build up throughout the succession, and then at the end, you have these very large trees that are decayed from the inside. The root rots are causing large infection centers, and like I said earlier, in a healthy forest, this is good. It creates opening, different age classes, new tree species are starting to grow. So that's, those are the cycles that helps you understand, the health of the forest. Of course, one of the big factors that affects the health of the forest is the human factor. Okay, big impact. First of all, by managing the forest. So we do clear cutting, we cut the trees, we leave behind stumps when we do the logging. That's often a source of entry for some pathogens. We do reforestation. The way we do reforestation affects the health of the forest. Sometimes we shift species. We cut lodgepole pine, we'll plant Douglas fir, for example. So those are the kind of shifts that might affect the health of the forest. We tend to suppress fire. That can affect the health of the forest as well. Some diseases are controlled naturally by fires, and when we control the fire, then we encourage those diseases, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. The other big human impact is we have in the last century, there's a lot of goods and people that traveled around the world. And by doing that, we've shifted pathogens around. And we've introduced exotic pathogens where they were not present before, breaking the natural balance in the forest. And we've got several examples of how that can cause ecosystem upheavals. We've also done the other way around. That is, we've planted trees that are not native here. We've planted hybrids of poplar, for example, that are hybrids between European and Asian poplar, and we plant them in North America. Well, then they get infected by pathogens that were not present in their center of origin. So that's the kind of exotic hosts that can be more susceptible to some of the native hosts that are more adapted or co-evolved to their pathogen. Finally, the last big human impact that we still have to learn a lot about, and it's still a big question mark, is the climate change. We've known that some climate change affect diseases. We have some examples of some pine needle blight, for example, that peaked with changes in the climate, wetter and longer summers, for example, that have made these diseases peak. So we know that in the future we have to look out for how climate change will affect the future health of the forest. Okay, this slide, what I want to show with this slide is that a tree you shouldn't think of a tree as just one organism. A tree is really an ecosystem that comprises a lot of different organisms, microorganisms, insects, all kinds of organisms really that are either feeding on the trees or that are helping the trees or that are symbiotic with the trees. If you look at this picture, you can see on the left that you have abiotic agents, so that those are agents that are not living, such as air pollution, for example, drought, frost, deficiency, and so on. So those can actually affect the tree, and it can also affect the pathogen, so it can actually interact to cause diseases. We also have on the right, you have biotic agents, so a variety of different biotic agents. Those are living organisms, okay? So pathogens that can cause diseases. And at the bottom, you have in the root system, you have the mycorrhizae, and the root pathogens. So these are fungi and pathogens that are infecting the roots. And so this whole process is basically a whole ecosystem that is dynamic. So you have leaves, you have stem, you have roots, and the symbionts, the mycorrhizae, are essential to the root system. You have endophytes in the leaves that are protecting the leaves. Then you have pathogens that can infect. Some of the endophytes can protect against the pathogens. Then you have all these abiotic stressors that can stress the tree, reduce the defense, and increase the attacks. So very dynamic system. We should not think of a tree as a single organism. We should think of it as an ecosystem, really. One of the concepts in plant pathology that is very, very important is the so-called disease triangle concept. And that concept says that in order to have a disease, you need to have a susceptible host, a virulent pathogen, and a conducive environment. And only when you have these three together do you get disease. And if you remove any of these components, you should be able to control disease. For example, if you have a susceptible plant that's attacked by a virulent pathogen, if you change the environment, for example, by reducing watering, then you reduce the humidity in your nurseries or in your plantation, then you can control the disease. Because even if it's a virulent pathogen attacking a susceptible host, if the humidity is not there, there will be no infection, there will be no disease. Okay, so this is a very, very important concept. And of course, the environment, we think of the environment, what's conducive for diseases. It's humidity, lots of rain, that's usually the case. But also now there's this man-made environment that's becoming very important, and that's pollution, climate change, and the things we were talking about earlier that can come and shape that environment. So this disease triangle, I think, is going to be very important in the future in terms of understanding how forest health will be affected by these changes. Okay, in that slide where I showed you the community of the trees, you know, we list bacteria and viruses and all these different types of living organisms. But really, when we talk about forest pathology, fungi is really the most important group, okay? And there's about 70,000 described species of fungi. But we think that's about only 5% of the species that are actually out there in the world. So the total number of species is probably 1.5 million of fungi. So there's a whole lot of species of fungi there that we don't know, or we don't even know that they exist. We have not named them yet. So comparison is birds. We have only about 8,000 species of birds, right? And we know most of them. So we have a big challenge when we work with fungi, okay? Because a lot of these species are not, we have no idea what they look like or where to look for them. But it's a very, very important group of fungi. What do these fungi do in the forest? Well, a variety of roles. And when you start thinking of the role of fungi in the forest, they're absolutely essential to the good functioning of the